Okay, awesome. So today we are here with a bunch of experts, and we're going to talk about crypto hacks and security lessons learned. So we're taking a closer look at several recent or maybe not so recent crypto security incidents so we can understand what happened, why it happened, and what we can learn. I'm C4's Executive Director, Jessica Levesque, and I'm really excited because I'm joined by a panel of outstanding security professionals. And you guys have tons of expertise across the digital asset security space. And before we get started, let's do intros so we know who is on the panel, and then we'll get into some of the specific incidents. So, all right, let's start with Adam. You want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. Adam Healy, CEO, co-founder of Station 70. We build a number of different products at the intersection of Web3 security and AI security. And I like to joke that I'm a CEO now, but I'm a recovering CISO, having been a CISO in the industry for probably about 8 years at Bakkt and BlockFi and a couple other spots.
Awesome. All right, Hadley?
Sure. So Hadley Stern, nice to be here, coming at you from Boston. Been in crypto for 11 plus years, more on the business side, but working and building very closely with security teams, both at Fidelity for the first version of Fidelity Digital Asset Services, and then also at Bank of New York Mellon, similar role there. And currently I advise companies. One of the companies I advise in this space is Silence Laboratories, quantum resistant MPC infrastructure. So looking forward to learning and talking with everyone today. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, Hadley. Jose?
Hey, hi. Thank you, Jess. Hi, everyone. My name is Jose Aguinaga. I've been also in the crypto industry for roughly 8 years or so. Based nowadays in Dubai. Happy to be supporting the defense team for as a key wallet on chain business provider. Previously, I was running a crypto custodian in Abu Dhabi, protecting assets for multiple individuals in the region, as well as being running crypto custodian solutions in Switzerland and other parts of the world. So happy to be here.
Awesome. Glad you're here. All right, Gianfranco?
Hello, I'm Gianfranco. I have been professionally in smart contract security for 3 years and a half. I have been in Open Zeppelin, with different roles, like developing security tools for vulnerability scan and also manual analysis. Recently I switched to AI, but I'm still very close connected to smart contract security because I'm still in the same firm at Open Zeppelin.
Awesome. And I feel like everyone in crypto is also sort of in AI now because we can't get our heads away from whatever the new emerging tech is. So, but you're officially in that role now. And then we have Andrew.
Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Chang-Gu. I'm a principal consultant at Mandiant, which is now part of Google Cloud. I come from crypto in a slightly different way. I've been in the cybersecurity industry for about 10 years. And recently have started working more with crypto clients. So, I'm bringing a lot of the traditional, security strategy and space into this new industry. And I'm really excited to be working with you guys and discussing our lessons learned from some of the crypto hacks that we've both tried to respond to, as well as the crypto security programs that we've been building for Web3 clients.
Awesome. Okay, well, we've got a pretty good group here today, I'd say, and I'm excited to learn from you all. So, okay, what are we doing today? Well, I think we all know that when a crypto hack happens or some type of incident, generally there's a big headline, and the question that's answered is usually how much was stolen. And that is often the focus. And I'm not saying that doesn't matter, it does, but what we're going to focus on today is a little bit of a different question. We can talk a little bit about the amount, but what we want to look at is what actually happened. So our goal isn't to criticize the organizations involved, it's to understand what happened and then discuss what the rest of the industry can learn from. We want these hacks to stop, so we're going to discuss what happens so we can avoid it in the future, and that's pretty much what we're doing today. We have a list of incidents on our end, and I will say that the list never ends. lessons, and it goes on and on and on. So we'll get to what we get to and have a, I think, interesting and useful conversation about what we see in the industry and what it is that we can do to make things better. So I want to open it up first to anyone here. Well, we've got this list. Are there any hacks that we have on this list or not that you guys are like, I got to talk about this. This keeps me up at night. I can't wait. I know we have enough, I'd say, lovely nerds on this call so that we can really get into some of them. So are there any hacks that you guys are like, I've been waiting to talk about this. Let's get into it. Or do we want to pick from our list? Ooh, okay. This is fun. Normally, I feel like people have like the one that keeps them up at night, but maybe we all have too many to even just pick one. Okay, so let's talk about some recent issues, some recent key management things that have happened. So does anyone want to go into the Polymarket hack, what just happened in May of 2026? I can give us an intro to start us off. But so what happened with that one is that it wasn't a smart contract exploit, which was, I feel like we so often hear, but it was another private key situation. And so an attacker obtained a private key for an internal operational wallet, and then they repeatedly transferred funds over several hours. So the user funds in the protocol weren't affected, but it did show how much damage just one operational key can cause if it's active. So any comments on what happened recently with the Polymarket hack?
I think it's worth mentioning, like, I think most, if not all, of these hacks are not about the protocol level itself or the cryptography of the underlying chain. So that's probably a good thing. But it's often about auditing particular access points to be able to enact something on the protocol. And in this case, it was a compromised private key associated with an internal operational wallet, which is something that almost everyone has.
Oh,
Ooh, we lost him right.
I think we lost Hadley.
Good.
I think I know where he was going with that, though. So
Okay.
him and I have spent enough time together to where I think I can read his mind sometimes. So, I think where he was going, and I happen to agree, is I think a lot of times what we see, especially in crypto, is, to Hadley's point, it's not the compromise of the protocol, a breaking of the cryptography. We do see a reasonable number of smart contract vulnerabilities that lead to things, but I think the prevailing situation is the intersection of two things. One, poor key management, right? So this is like a problem. I often talk about, like, in TradFi or in just any non-crypto enterprise, I don't know many firms that are like really good at key management, like really good at root CAs, really good at PKI, really good. Like, it's a really unique skill that not a lot of folks have. So there's the intersection of that, right? For key management. And then the other intersection, and this is paramount in the Web3 ecosystem, the digital asset ecosystem, is the intersection of just really bad enterprise Web2, if we want to call it that, cybersecurity controls. Like, are you doing least privilege? Are you doing role-based access control? Do you have hardware tokens for multi-factor? Do you have device trust? And like, in this list that I scrolled through of breaches that we're going to discuss, there is this reoccurring theme, some of which I have more data on than others, but it ultimately comes down to, and not in every case, but like the theme seems to usually be in these cases where you have this key management and enterprise cybersecurity hygiene problem, is phishing or social engineering leads to a compromised account, leads to a compromised device. There's no device trust, leads to this, boom, compromised key. So I actually, the analogy that I've used for probably too many years, and during COVID, I said I was going to get a new analogy, but I didn't, is you can take all the antibiotics you want, but if you don't wash your hands, you're still going to get sick. And there are a lot of firms that really focused on the antibiotics, the exotic things that they want to do that's like Web3 specific, but then they just don't wash their hands, right? They don't have CrowdStrike, they don't have SentinelOne, they don't have device trust. They don't have to do the basics, and then they get compromised. I think that's, if we really had the report from Polymarket on what happened, my guess is that it started with social engineering or phishing, or both.
Yeah, I just want to. Sorry, Jessica. I want to reiterate Adam's point. I'm coming from the traditional Web 2 security space, and there's certain best practices that have been in place for the last decade or more. For example, device trust is a great example of that. And we see a lot of resistance in certain crypto firms, certain Web3 native companies to implement these traditional cybersecurity controls, right? Because we're talking about basically installing antivirus and anti-malware controls on employees' devices, and they might be their own personal devices that they use for everyday purposes as well. So there's a lot of this using personal devices and not having the corporate kind of security hygiene that is taken for granted in traditional Web 2 companies that Web3 firms are now grappling with. And it's not so much, sometimes it's not so much that they know that that they think they don't need it, but it's more of the fact that they don't want to implement it because of cultural reasons. So there needs to be a little bit of a give and pull there.
And it's also, I think, in like Web3 companies, there's like budget constraints, right? There's a lot of firms that are like bootstrapping things, and they're not going to go out and buy 10 $4,000 MacBooks for each of their staff. And that comes into, those are constraining factors. I always tell people, like, if you can't have dedicated company hardware and you can't do device trust, like, at least deploy YubiKeys. Like, at least harden some aspect of the identity device app, triangulation.
Yeah. Jump in.
Gianfranco, I think you want to go next.
Yeah. No, just I have been checking the transactions in the chain, and one curious thing about this exploit is that if you check the transactions, like, it has been like the key that has been compromised, it has been run with batches of 5,000 Ks or 10Ks. There are different transactions in both like native currency, Polygon, or USDC. And the thing that like what it says this to me is that the private key, it hasn't been directly compromised because otherwise there will be just a single transaction leaking everything. So the exploit might compromise a piece of software that had the credentials and didn't have the full control of the key or the capacity of the extract the private key, but they had a third layer credential that allowed them to use that piece of software with that credentials to perform this action. So we have to protect also these third layers of access level.
Yeah, I definitely don't envy you all that are working on the security side when there's so many different things that could happen and so many things to focus on. It's not just one thing, right? It all comes together. Jose, were you going to say something?
Yeah, no, I was going to comment on Adam's point as well, that unfortunately, it is very true that when you enter, and particularly for people that have been in the industry for quite a long time, it is unfortunate, I will say, that because of the nature of the crypto industry that, was a very grassroots kind of movement, not everybody that got into the industry necessarily had a strong security background or even operational hygiene, to make a pun on Adam's point about, hygiene. Because the reality is that when one of the appeals of the crypto industry was the very quick access to money, but then we realize why high financial institutions and other large organizations, they have all these procedures, because they, at the end of the day, when you're handling money, which is one type of assets, when you have other sort of valuable assets that not necessarily are tangible digital currencies, then you start seeing these patterns. And I think we're only now catching up, and unfortunately, as we keep seeing in these headlines, not fast enough to what it is industry standard. And I think, Andre, that's only what we were mentioning. Just basic, XDR practices, just basic operational securities that normal traditional tech companies have been put in place for the I will even argue more than a decade. The startups that are entering the crypto industry are still not able to do that, right? So I do celebrate Adam's point about like what is the low hanging fruit about, I agree. I don't think everybody, all startup that wants to build the next DeFi protocol can, support the enterprise CrowdStrike license. Sure. They cannot pay perhaps CyberArk, whatever. But what is the low-hanging fruit that a lot of these teams can do? Okay, can you secure your supply chain? Can you get a KMS? Like something that just makes sure that even if you're doing a deployment smart contract, rather than it being a private key you generated in your terminal, why don't you use something that has a little bit some sort of security or provenance capabilities? But yeah.
I do think, just adding to Jose's point, I do agree that there's an imbalance on the DeFi side in terms of traditional security practices, but also having been inside some very big TradFi institutions, there's also an imbalance. They bring to the table incredible structure and rigor in terms of line 1, line 2, line 3, and traditional risk operations and monitoring, and of course, budget. But what they lack, where the DeFi side can really help, is the understanding of multi-sig, the understanding of how these signing protocols and blockchains actually work. So I actually think that the sweet spot for this is going to be a melding of the best of DeFi security and understanding of how these technologies work, with the best of TradFi or traditional, not just TradFi, but traditional CISO operations to harden everything, because there's pieces to be learned from both teams.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with what you all have been saying. It's also interesting that I think sometimes we see like one thing and we say, well, this is why this happened. But often it's multiple things that come together from both sides as well. So we often see security weaknesses in more than one place. And like Adam brought up Drift Protocol before we went on this call. And I was like, oh, we'll talk about it if we talk about it. Now here I am bringing it up because I don't think any of us can kind of get away from it right now. It's very present because it was like they ran the long game. Right. And so it's some Web 2 things. And maybe, Adam, you want to explain it, but we are seeing both sides of the coin on this. And there are many things that happen, but this wasn't like no, I was just going to say, this wasn't just like, oh, I think I'm going to do like a hack. This was like the long game. So do you want to walk us a little bit through this?
Yeah. So I'll be a little bit like cautious of what I say, because I don't think everything is public yet, or maybe will ever be. But Drift was not a normal breach. And I usually, and Jessica, you did a good job of cautioning us beforehand to not talk too poorly about any of the target companies, which most of us do in private channels. But I actually feel really bad for the Drift guys. I have a lot of empathy for them, because that compromise, that breach, was not a simple, hey, you should have had YubiKeys and device trust and you would have been fine. Or in the case like the Bybit/Gnosis safe, whatever we're calling it today, hey, you should have had CrowdStrike and your developer machine wouldn't have gotten compromised, which is a whole other discussion around like third-party risk management to some of the things Hadley was talking about, which could be interesting to talk about the Bybit breach. But back to Drift. Drift was a multi-month, multi-quarter nation-state level intelligence operation. It was incredibly sophisticated. And, I was talking to somebody, well-known industry CISO. We were in a group chat, and Hadley may even remember this conversation. And the person said, I find it really hard to believe that the guys that Drift met at the conference, the threat actors that were at the conference that did some of the initial social engineering at the conference to provide some bona fides and other things, like, how did they not know they were North Koreans? And my question was, well, how do you know they were North Koreans? And I think as some of the details of this comes out, we will all know that they were in fact not North Koreans, and that they may or may not have been winning to what they were actually doing at the behest of North Korea. And they may have thought that they were actually working on a legitimate crypto project, and we're at this conference providing bona fides to the drift guys unwittingly. So there's a lot, like that was a very sophisticated nation state level multi-quarter intelligence operation that, I'll be honest, like, I having been part of some fairly sophisticated security programs, to include it back to where we were under the Intercontinental Exchange, multi-billion, $70 billion publicly traded company kind of security program. I don't know that we would have actually been able to stop that. Maybe we would have stopped it before the key, there were actually like a full compromise, but it was very sophisticated. And I have a lot of empathy for the drift team on that one, because they were certainly ultimately at the end of the day accountable, but I don't know that they were necessarily like responsible for all the failure modes, because it was that sophisticated.
That's such a good point in terms of like, it goes back to the blame game, right? Sometimes it's useful to be aware of it, and sometimes it's like, well, this is somewhat out of their control, or how would they have known, or at what point do we go to such extent, like a deep extent in security, that we can no longer offer products or even participate in the crypto space. So there's definitely, I think, give and take to this, but if you do something dumb, like really dumb, I feel like people are going to be like, okay, let's definitely call this out. But then there are also times where no one's perfect. There are all these are intentional, well thought out. It's not like somebody going into a store and being like, oh, I'm just going to like grab this, bread and walk out. This is like long-term thinking, obviously a lot more than bread. But I think that's a good point in terms of like, how do you hire somebody who's, with DPRK? Well, you don't know, or they might not know that they were hired. There's like all of these kind of like chains that
cutouts, cutouts and assets that are in play. The way I kind of usually like to explain this to folks that maybe are not super security minded, like this stuff happens, like something like drift, like this stuff happens. It's very hard to prevent against, because there's so many different angles, right? There's malware angles, there's social engineering, there's in-person meetings. It's very hard. You can just take like, the US intelligence community spends billions of dollars a year on security, and they still occasionally get compromised by an insider threat or by a double agent or some type of other, nefarious bad actor. So these things happen. And the question, I think, in the hallmark of a good security program is not necessarily preventing every bad thing from happening, because eventually over a long enough time horizon, bad things will happen. It is how quickly can you identify and then contain the bad thing happening once you've detected it. Like that is usually the way that I would instrument a good security program from a great one, is you assume that you'll not be able to, assume breach is kind of the term, assume that these things will happen, and then how quickly can you detect and contain once it occurs.
Isn't that a point where drift could be criticized, right? Because there was one private key that had access to kind of everything. Isn't that right? Not to throw blame on them again, but this is where
I'm trying to follow Jessica's rules here.
Hold on. The rule is like, let's be aware that sometimes these things happen, and like, we're not here to throw them under the bus. But at the same point, like, let's acknowledge that when mistakes are made, if we pretend they weren't made, we just keep repeating them, which is what I kind of feel like we've been doing for years. Like in this industry, it's like, oh, well, this happened. Oh, well, that already happened. And then this happened. Well, that happened too. So let's learn. But that's okay, Hadley. You can jump in. We don't need to like shit all over them, but we can sympathize, but also like, that's true. That did happen. So
I mean, it's just another perimeter of defense, right? So Adam's spot on. Though I think Adam would probably put that in the detection category, right? You need to have systems that monitor and understand when something's going on. And then another piece that I would put on there is, making sure that your threat plane isn't everything from one thing. Is also something to design for. But again, it leads to operational complexity where, like you were saying, we need to be able to offer products and services to people. We also need to be able to operate platforms in a fast and scalable way. So, I mean, I guess in theory, you could have, I don't know, a 24-hour delay for every $1 transaction. But I don't think you get much of a business going there. So it is this balance of guardrails that are sensible, where everything's not completely open, and everything's not completely shut down, and that's the delicate art of this space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if we go too far one direction, no one's going to use the product, right? But at the same time, don't you want to be using products that are really secure and safe? I mean, the issue of third-party vendors is extremely problematic. I was just in a CCSS training the other day, and I told this story, and I feel like it's such a good one, so it's on my mind. I was at a conference once. I was talking to somebody, and they said, "Oh yeah, well we use," and he pointed like across down a booth. And he said, "Well, we use them for our wallet." And I said, "Oh, well, do you know that they use them?" And I pointed down the line. I said, "And that they use them?" And the guy's looking at me like, "What?" He had no idea the chain of companies involved in what he was doing. And his company was a custodian. And the expression on his face as I was saying this horrified me. This was like 5 years ago, and I still have nightmares about it, because we're talking about someone using these other systems and he doesn't even know where they come from. So I think that's like back to the accountability piece.
But I would push back on one thing there, which is companies actually want to know they're using secure products. I actually don't think most companies do. Because due diligence questionnaires are horrible. Like it's just like the whole thing. Like, I don't know that most companies do. A lot of companies are driven by the business, which is not necessarily wrong, because you have to make money to afford a security program. But they want the easy button to get operational and to run the business as fast as possible. And to your point, like there's a handful of things that I look at anytime I'm evaluating whether it's a competitor or a vendor or a partner, that you can just like find in DNS logs and find there's like stuff on the internet that you can use to determine if the company takes something seriously. And I mean, I actually posted about this on LinkedIn a couple months ago. There's a company in Web3 right now that's been around for 5 years that is used by a couple hundred large firms. And they couldn't even get their SPF records correct. So like, what does that tell you about how they think about security? But none of their hundreds of customers ever check that. Like, no one ever noticed that. And then the question becomes like, well, if you're not doing the easy stuff right, do I really trust you with my keys and doing the hard stuff right? So I actually really wonder if companies even really care when they're thinking about vendor selection, if like security matters.
Probably depends on the company too. Go ahead, Jose. Right? Like, who's in charge?
What I was going to mention, Adam, and I commend him on the high bar of expectation that we should have across all these providers. But I think
SPF records are not a high bar. Let's just be fair.
I agree, but I wish that would not be the case. But apparently, right? Like, apparently, the evidence tells us that seems to be the case, right? And that's to me, and in terms of when I look at some of the issues, is exactly right. It's like, what do we think it is the posture that some of the companies should take to be able, before they engage in these capacities? And I think, for better or worse, again, bear with me with my 2 cents coming from working in a regulatory environment. In some way, I do value how sometimes regulators try to push up a lot of these companies to catch up with these requirements. Obviously, never going to be fast enough, and it's usually reactionary to some of the hacks that we see on the deadlines. But I do think it's becoming more and more common to have that, at least that some sort of third-party entity, and not your sham SOC 2 Type 2 that has random control that anybody can get online nowadays, but rather some sort of respectable entity, respectable certification. And then again, maybe I'm doing a little bit of marketing for CCSS, but something that actually knows what they're talking about and probably can stand in its own legs under the minor scrutiny. I think a lot of what we're going to be seeing in the hacks, and what we see in other hacks that we haven't seen, is they don't stand, and after just minor checks in some controls and some capacities, they don't do right. And to Adam's point, I wish that some vendors that you will think that are handling billions will have checked that a third-party provider had at least a SOC 2 or even the sham ones, but apparently they didn't, right? And how can you say you're a respectable company in the industry when you are not able to do a third-party risk management on your supply chain. And that's the part that it is tough, because I think we're all catching on, we're all doing your best. And again, for a lot of people in the industry and the Web2 industry, this is just basic. But for a lot of the Web3 industry, it hasn't, right? And I wish that the bar were higher, but it isn't. And I think it's the work that a lot of our players that, particularly I think people in this room are trying to push the bar higher and higher. But the reality is we're not where we should be, right? And the accountability, and maybe as a nice segue on that, the accountability is a hard thing, right? I can think just from the top of my head, hacks that we don't have the full details, that we know that what happened is we have some understanding, but to Adam's point, a lot of those details don't come to light. And then 6 months later, we see a hack that it has very similar patterns, where we say, oh, it's unfortunate that it became a blaming game or finger pointing, because also people lose money, and that also affects livelihoods and businesses. But I wish we as a community we were trying to put more effort on trying to disclose things faster and better in a more transparent way. So whenever all these things unfortunately happen, we as an industry can protect ourselves more. Because what I see is that as trust erodes the ecosystem, which I believe has happened over the past 5 years since NFT summer, DeFi summer, of course everybody in the industry is going to get affected, right? Prices are going to go down, money is going to get pulled out, right? So even if your company doesn't get affected because whatever hack, of course it's going to go down, and indirectly, if you're in the industry, you're going to get affected one way or the other. So,
well, and I think part of it too is like, how do you know who to trust? Because sometimes the finger pointing game is you're trusting somebody, like we talk about Bybit and Safe. There's finger pointing, but if you ultimately are the company that hires another company that's not safe, how responsible are you for using that other company? How much information should we be expecting to have and to know, and how do we even determine what to ask? Andrew, I don't know if you want to talk at all about like how you help companies evaluate who to trust or how that even works, but I think there's it's tough. Like if it's tough to know, and like Adam, you mentioned due diligence, reports, how useful are they? Like what, Andrew, I know that's a big part of what you do. How do you even help clients determine what clients they should be working with?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I've worked on assessments where I get hired by, maybe a TradFi organization who is now just onboarding, a DeFi or a Web3 vendor to help them, get into DeFi, to help them get into Ethereum. And what's interesting oftentimes is that there's very little Web3 specific security checks that go into onboarding vendors. And, I think we talked a little bit about this, about, these third-party vendor checklists that we often, get vendors to do. Oftentimes those are legacy kind of security controls that we're asking about, and they don't really ask anything about Web3 specific security. They don't ask, about any of the controls that CCSS would have, right? About whether they did a key ceremony, whether they have like MPC wallets to secure their private keys. And the interesting thing about that is that a lot of, at least the TradFi companies that I'm working with and the traditional companies I'm working with, are almost walking in blind into the Web3 world by onboarding these vendors. And as a result, like they're exposing themselves to a lot of Web3 specific risk. So we do assessments where we go in and we talk about the Web3 specific things, but that requires, one, a willingness from the organization that hired the vendor to even spend the money to do the assessment. And then two, it requires a willingness from the vendor to kind of go above and beyond and make those resources and materials available for us to assess, right? So we have to talk directly to the vendor to figure out, okay, well, what security controls do you have in place? Are those security controls actually implemented at, in this client that you guys have. And so as a result, there are ways to do it. And the issue is that it costs right now, it costs money to do these assessments. A lot of these companies that are onboarding these vendors, they themselves don't have the security expertise to do it internally. And they're maybe taking on an unknown amount of risk or amount of risk that they're not really cognizant of or aware of by onboarding these vendors. So I think my recommendation to Web3 firms that are onboarding vendors or utilizing outside resources is to figure out, like, do we even have the expertise to figure out whether or not this vendor is secure, right? And if we don't, then maybe look into a third-party vendor assessment, like have a consultant or some other sort of subject matter expert look into the vendor integration before you onboard them, so that we have an understanding of what risks we're increasing or decreasing or offboarding to them.
It's interesting.
I would add two things to
Adam,
that. One is,
say,
oh yeah, sorry.
This made me think of your antibiotics thing again. If you're being told take the antibiotics, but you're not washing your hands, so you're like, oh, I want to get on this antibiotics, and no one ever tells you to wash your hands, or like that's not actually so, then you're not doing the things that you should be doing anyways to mitigate the risk. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's so like I have like a very controversial view on like vendor diligence, because like what you're talking about also, Jessica, is like fourth party risk, like my third parties, so on and so forth. It's this like game of Inception where I can't wake up from the dream or like whatever. So the problem is like the due diligence questionnaires that exist today are horrible. And I'm sure Mandiant has a phenomenal one for like Web3. I've built one that's based on CCSS and NIST, what is it, 50-63, or like the PKI NISTs. Like I've built one out that has 7 or 8 different frameworks that are boiled into it. And it's like only like 50 questions. But the other side of it is like, so the due diligence questionnaire is like really bad. Second is kind of to Andrew's point, like when the answers come back, most firms are not capable of then asking the next tranche of questions that then follow up. Like I've seen one where a vendor happens to be a competitor to Station 70, so I won't name them, said we have a vault. Okay, well, like what does that mean? And then as you probe on the third or the second or third or fourth round of questions, they finally admit, well, they rent a safety deposit box in a bank vault. It's like, okay, so you don't like own a vault, you have a safety deposit box. And it's like a lot of people on the other side, on the vendor side of the table, and as a vendor myself, we one of our like ethical boundaries is we don't mislead people with marketing terminology. Is a lot of firms will, though, like they will use the spin and the nuance of words to play games with their answers in due diligence questionnaires. And unless you have somebody that like has seen this 100 times and knows to like call like BS on it, your firm might, your internal audit team, your chief, your risk team, your whomever, just be like, hey, that sounds right. Like that sounds great. They have a vault. Let's just keep going.
Yeah, and just to add to what Adam's saying, I think one of the differences, or I know one of the differences between the Web3 world and the TradFi world is the TradFi world at a certain level will go out and validate all those items on a questionnaire in person physically. So they'll not only want to see your ops docs and policies and procedures, they'll want to observe them in operation in person in your offices over the span of a week. So this is the kind of security practice where I fear sometimes that people consider that either the due diligence docs are the deliverable. To me, they're not the deliverable. They set the foundation for the next phase of security investigation to understand if things are really getting done. And that's the kind of thing that a tier 1 bank will do. They won't just accept the documentation as evidence that a particular security action is taking place.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know what you don't know, huh?
Yeah, you don't, and I would say it's also not a one and done thing in a typical tier one bank operation. There could be quarterly check-ins, annual check-ins, and it's not a launch and then we're done, as we know in this space. It's a constantly evolving, exhausting kind of continuous process that needs updating and diligence because the threat vectors continually change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. This is the threat vectors constantly change. We're running after trying to resolve new things when there are a lot of, like we brought up, Web 2 issues that are continuing to follow into Web 3. So if we haven't done the basics, then how are we going to catch up on all the things that are more difficult? Like you brought up SPF earlier, Adam. If we're not doing the things that we need to already be doing, then how are we going to add in all this additional, all the additional controls?
But funny enough, the SPF example and the Vault example are the same company.
Interesting.
But again, it's those like data points, right? Where you're like, should you trust this company as you look at diligence?
So the marketing angle is also just fascinating in that we've had this problem for a long, probably since marketing became advertising was a thing, but you'll go and look at somebody's website or go to a conference and you get all this information, but a lot of it's created by marketing teams, not the security teams. If it said exactly what the security team wanted, no one would buy the product because it would be so technical. It wouldn't be understood by most people. But the marketing kind of dilutes it or sometimes changes what's actually happening, which is why we need to have people that can really go in and do that, like what's below the glitter and gold and what's actually happening. And I think AI is really impacting that in terms of the marketing situation. But also, like, we made a joke in the chat, but I actually think it's probably not a joke. People using AI to do their risk assessments and thinking that that's good enough. Putting it, like, pulling in the info and having AI make the decision for a company rather than having all of these different tools be pulled together and from different angles. And I'm not like trying to say AI is not great for it. It is, but I don't think that it solves the problem.
Like one of the things there, like that I, at BlockFi that I harped on a lot was if you're having, and obviously BlockFi was 1,000+ people, billions of dollars in custody. Like it was a bigger of the crypto platforms. So we had budget to do these things, but if you're having legal review your marketing copy before it goes out, you should have security also review it. And one of the things that you could probably actually shortcut with AI, I don't know that you'd want to shortcut the legal side. I would personally, but some of the lawyers may disagree with me, is you could actually build a Claude skill around like security review for marketing content and just say, hey, marketing team, run this Claude skill before you push new marketing content. And then if anything flags, hit up, your GRC lead or whomever just to give it a sanity check.
That's a good tip. Okay, so we've covered like kind of a broad range of different things. One thing I wanted to talk about, kind of get back to the Web 2, Web 3. So I wanted to bring up this, the phishing that we see. And a lot of times I think we think of Web 3 as just like, online phishing. This is all very focused on, maybe we, meaning like the layperson. If I'm not interacting with the computer in a wallet, then this isn't something that's necessarily impacting me. But there was a incident recently with Bitcoin Depot, and the issue comes back to phishing and social engineering. But what I think is so fascinating is that the phishing letters were sent like snail mail to people. And I feel like we often believe that these things are so separate, but they're not. If we're talking about users that aren't that well-versed in technology, we see people going back to kind of the old system of things. And again, this is impacting real people, real companies. And basically what happened was people were convinced to enter their seed phrases into, go ahead.
I was going to say, sorry to interrupt. Same with Ledger recently.
Yes.
That this is a great example where someone got their CRM and suddenly physical letters. And you're absolutely right, because it's such a it's such a sneaky security attack because I saw one of the letters and it was kind of using the fact that a letter was being sent as evidence that the company was more security minded, and so using kind of another factor of communication. So you're absolutely right. These things are endless in their creativity.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we have to think about is the fact that, when it comes to Web3 and blockchain specific attacks, the potential payout is much higher than maybe a traditional cybersecurity attack where maybe you're just stealing someone's credit card number, maybe you're stealing their personal health information. Those things sell on the dark market for maybe tens of dollars per per stolen credit card or per a health record. But when it comes to private keys and to the things that they want to exploit on the Web3 side, like those are worth potentially hundreds and thousands of even millions of dollars for the threat actor. And as a result, that opens up a whole nother avenue of potential attack paths, right? You would have never used snail mail to target people if it was just for their credit card numbers, or if it's just for your traditional targets in a cyber attack. But if it's Web3 specific targets, private keys, account information, things like that, then suddenly me as a threat actor spending up to $10 per potential, a threat makes sense, right? And that opens up again, snail mail is a good example of this, potentially, live attacks where they're calling you and, maybe they're even using AI to do like a phishing type of scam where they sound like your, significant other, or they sound like someone that you trust. They can even use that technology to make themselves look like a different person. There's all these sorts of attacks that cost money as the attacker to perform, but because they're going after such high value targets in the form of cryptocurrency, it becomes financially viable for them, right? So we have to kind of think about a whole nother different type of attack techniques that are viable for attackers only because of the high value of the targets they're going after.
What's fascinating about this is we're talking about such different, it's the same ecosystem, same idea of money being lost, people, losing trust, but we've got this vast landscape of threats. So we were just talking about social engineering in terms of like phishing, snail mail, getting, addresses, CRMs, as Hadley brought up with the Ledger attack, all of this. And then we still have the really technical exploits as well, which is why these conversations are so interesting. And one of the things I wanted Gianfranco to talk about a little bit, which is on the way other end of this, but I think is really useful to show just how broad our knowledge needs to be, is I think you want to talk a little bit about the safe hack, Gianfranco. And this is a much more technical example of what the ecosystem needs to work on. But I think it's useful to bookend this a little bit with these two different looks. So Gianfranco, do you want to walk us through the smart account?
Yeah, I want to discuss the technical depth that the Ethereum ecosystem has with the Gnosis wallet, because it caused for example, the biggest exploit in smart contracts. Like it has been the Bybit, and it has not been directly a code exploit of the multi-signature, because there was a vulnerability in the code, but it was related also to social engineering, exploiting a bad UX in the smart contracts. So my takes are that even if the smart contracts are secure, if the interaction with them is still complicated, like this opens to the exploiters to exploit these complications interacting with the smart contracts, like to maybe hide some malicious transactions. That it happened a lot. For example, if you have to execute a transaction in an Ethereum multi-signature from Safe, that is the is the only when you think about multi-signature, you directly fall back to Ceph because it's the number one vendor in the ecosystem. So if you have to verify like with your hardware wallet a transaction, like with the small screen of the hardware wallet, is impossible to verify. So you have to somehow blindly sync them. So these failures in the like this bad UX in the usage of this multi-signatures wallet causes like the exploiters know them, they like know these issues, and they can construct different techniques to trick the signers. And the biggest example is the Bybit hack, but this hack that you proposed in the list, the Gnosis Pay hack, is also related to a bad UX, because there were like third players that developed smart contracts in this hack, and you have the smart account, but the smart account have the functionality of modules, and you can install a Zodiac module, but it's built in a way that the first question that you have to ask is why you want to install some module, because the wallet doesn't have a basic functionality, for example, a time lock, that is a delay in the transactions that being executed. So just because you don't have this single functionality, you have to rely on a third-party vendor to install a module in your Ceph Mart account. And this model, like, it gives the full control of your wallet, so it can execute. You have to blindly trust in this third-party code. And it's not just like all this construction is so complicated. You have Zodiac, you have the Gnosis smart account, like maintained by the own team, but all this construction is being included in the user product Gnosis Pay when you create when you create your credit card from your Gnosis Pay, you are implicitly creating for you a smart wallet with all this like hard construction, with all this hard UI UX that is difficult for the users to understand. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I feel like the theme across this, and I guess all these in general, is that there are so many different pieces to this. How do we protect against it? And especially when we're going from, I'd say, something that seems really obvious to overlook to something that's extremely technical. We have all of these different threats coming in. Like I said earlier, I don't know how you guys do it, because it just feels like it's not just raining down from the top. It's coming in from the sides. It's splashing up. So how, I think talking about this, learning, educating, understanding is a really big part of it. And that's why, like, we're not trying to blame companies, but like, let's acknowledge what's happened so we can avoid this in the future. And if you know the same, if you keep learning the same lesson over and over again, we have a problem.
It's an interesting point, right? It's like, there's all this stuff. And I was talking to the risk committee at a bank a couple months ago about this, and they're getting into crypto, and they're like, they have all these cybersecurity controls, and then you layer in things like AI risk, and what does that mean, especially when you start deploying agents within your perimeter, and now you have this whole new class of insider threats, and then you factor in the wrench attacks within crypto. And I was like, hey, the short answer here is you now have to do all of these things well. You can't just pick and choose. You have to do all of your cybersecurity, legacy, Web 2, whatever you want to call it, cybersecurity, hygiene, basic cyber hygiene well. You have to do all your Web 3 custody, infrastructure, key management, well. You have to do your AI security implementation really well. There's, because I believe that it's only a matter of time before we see a large Web 3 breach that was AI generated, like agent based, gets a private key, bad things happen. And then you also have to do all of your wrench attack security really well also. So you have to do it all well. That's like the unfortunate, really expensive answer.
And just to add a little cost item on there, doing it really well often means not just one team that does it, but line one does it in the business, line two, a dedicated group within a company that challenges and has the authority to challenge, and line three, external experts, including many people on this call who are involved in it. So it takes a team and it takes an ever-evolving and growing team.
One of the things we talk about in our CCSS training, which Gianfranco and Jose have been through, I can't remember if you have, Andrew, maybe you've been through part of it, but is this idea of accountability. And we've got all of these people who report to other people who are trying to convince these others that they should do certain things for security, or create talk to the budget department to say, well, we actually need money for this. And then maybe it's not going to be, the best way to go about and do it, but the person in charge. So I think there's multiple different ways that we can look at this. I also want to point out that it depends on the company, right? It really, really does. And yeah, I just think that these are interesting things to pay attention to, and we need to keep having these conversations, which we will. The best part about these discussions is that we come up with a list of hacks and we never get through them. There's always so many others that are at our fingertips, and I think that's just okay, because it's really shows what the threat landscape in Web3 looks like. You can't just focus on one thing, because it all ties in together. It's like a massive web of problems, but also fun. A lot of fear, scary, but obviously we're all in this because we love it. But there's definitely a lot of different pieces to this. So, okay, we're actually over time, and of course still didn't get through a ton of our hacks. I'm guessing everyone on this call could talk about this for another 7 to 12 hours. We won't do that though. But we will probably do follow-ups where we have you guys on to talk about additional other hacks. But if anyone has to drop, go ahead. For the rest of us, if there's additional things you want to jump in and add to, please do. I'm here and available, so I don't want to cut anybody off, but I also know if you have to go, you have to go. So any other thoughts people want to jump in?
I'll leave some closing thoughts on my end, and I'll have them for you to drop off. But if there's something that I would like to cover, it's unfair jumping on a chat with Adam, because he covers most of the stuff that I want to say anyway, given his experience in the industry. But yeah, I mean, the analogy of the washing hands is just on point, and I think I will probably invite listeners and people that are aware about the industry, and nobody wants to see their money go away, to try to do their best in terms to rely on battle tested proofs. I don't think anybody needs to become a CISO or a security expert tomorrow. But I do think the resources that are nowadays out there are far superior than the ones that used to be perhaps 5-4 years ago. And the fact that we have organizations like CCSS helping and setting up these sort of standards, it's just something that should help or guide everybody that is trying to play in the industry. So I'm not saying that everybody should try to get a CCS certification if you're a provider or playing in the industry, but at the minimum, I think it's helpful to look at the what is the consortium looking at in terms of what are good practices. And if you identify something that it's a low-hanging fruit, particularly the level ones, which are the basic frameworks, and how those standards try to push people to do better practices, I think those are already good things to secure. So that's it on my end. Chess, thank you so much for having me and for having such a group of smart people in the room.
One thing you just brought up that Adam brought up earlier is just like the CCSS, it's free. So Adam was talking, I mentioned the training. Adam's using the CCSS because it is open and free. So like this is something that anyone can use and reference, and you don't have to pay to use it. It's just there. So please do, but also it doesn't cover everything, right? This is a very niche security standard about private key management. So also just because you are CCSS certified doesn't mean you're doing everything else right either. There's a bunch of other pieces to this that we also, as security-minded individuals and companies, need to be paying attention to. It's not one size fits all.
Gonna hard that, and I'm gonna call it my day for man. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take good care.